Hey macro students, welcome to Module 68, Budget Deficits and Public Debt. So in this whole unit, we've been talking about, this aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve and how that curve works, what causes aggregate demand to go up and down, what causes short-run aggregate supply to go up and down, and what long-run equilibrium means. We have talked about how when an economy gets in a recessionary or an inflationary gap, the economy can fix itself. And last module, we talked about the idea of if the economy isn't going to fix itself, what can the government do in order to help fix the economy? And in a recessionary gap, a lot of what the government does to try to fix the economy is spend a ton of money. So now we're going to kind of talk about, well, what are the consequences of the government spending that much money? All right, so first we're going to go over this vocab word of budget balance. The budget balance is basically the answer to the question, did the government spend more or less money than they have? All right, so S, government. That is the savings that the government has. That's also the budget balance. So savings of the government. All right, so T is taxes. G is, of course, government spending. And TR is transfer payments. So it basically means like the budget balance, oops, wrong way, or any money that the government has, there you take the amount of tax money that they got, like the money they took in, you subtract the money they spent, and you subtract the money that they sent out as transfer payments. And whatever is left, if there's any money left over, that means they have a positive budget balance. And if they don't have any money left over, they can actually go negative, then that's a negative budget balance. So we have here this term, so these are our different vocab terms, budget balance, budget deficit. Okay, so this term budget deficit, when the government spends more money than they take in tax revenue. So it is called a negative budget balance, and it's when the government spending plus the tax revenue, government spending plus transfer payments is greater than tax revenue or taxes, the money they got in. So if you're like me and you always forget what these symbols mean, that is the greater than symbol. Okay. Now some people say, well, like, how can they spend more money than they make? Well, or than they get in tax revenue with loans. Okay. So we might want to do that or add that in. How do they do that? With loans. So if they are going to spend more money than they make, they have to do that with loans. Just like, for example, if I spent more money this year than I made this year, I could do that in two ways. One, I could do it with any savings that I have, or two, I could do it with loans. Well, the government never has any savings, so they're doing it with loans. All right, so the budget surplus, when the government spends less money than they take in tax revenue. It is called a positive budget balance, and it's when government spending plus transfer payments are less than taxes. We see a budget surplus every once in a while at the state level, but we never see it these days at the government level. They're always spending, spending, spending. All right, so a balanced budget, it's when government spending equals tax revenue. So when government spending plus transfer payments equals tax revenue. So those are just three terms. You will hear those terms in life. They will be talking about the budget deficit and the budget surplus. And a lot of people say we need to have a balanced budget, meaning if somebody says the government needs to have a balanced budget, they are saying that the government needs to figure out a way to not spend more money than they have. All right, so budget deficits increase during recessionary gaps and decrease during inflationary gaps. And let's talk about why. Well, a recessionary gap is a bad economy, right? Recessionary gap. And that means that people are not making a lot of money. A lot of people are out of work, or their wages have gone down, or their profits have gone down in business, which means that people pay less in taxes. Well, if people are paying less in taxes, then the government isn't getting as much of that tax money, right? So like, if the economy is bad and I usually make $100,000 a year and now I'm making $50,000 a year, well, you pay a lot less taxes on 50 grand a year than you do on 100 grand. So, that's just how that works. If people and businesses have less money, they pay less in taxes. So it's this situation where the economy is bad, and then the government wants to fix it by spending more money. So they're spending more money and getting less money, right? Like that means that they're going to have a bigger budget deficit. All right, so another thing, if the economy is bad, the unemployment rate goes up. Well, when the unemployment rate goes up, that means that the government pays more in transfer payments. They're going to pay more in unemployment insurance. They're going to pay more in other types of transfer payments, because a lot of people, if they lose their jobs, then they're going to end up on like food stamps. If they lose their jobs, then they're going to end up needing housing assistance, that kind of stuff. So unemployment rate goes up, they pay more money in transfer payments such as unemployment insurance and food stamps, or WIC, I guess we can call it WIC, and SNAP, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, next one. If the economy is bad, then the government enacts expansionary fiscal policy. So that means the government spending goes up or taxes go down. So, oh my gosh, so that means they're in this situation where they're getting less money from people in taxes because people are making less money, people and businesses. They're paying out more in transfer payments. And then they're going to start spending more money on like infrastructure projects and other stuff. And then they're going to decrease taxes. So then their tax revenues are going to go even further down, right? So what this means, right, like this whole therefore, in a recession, government gets less money in taxes and spends more money in government spending and transfer payments. So if you have this situation, right, when you're getting less money and you're spending more money, that means you're having to borrow a lot of money to fill in those gaps. Okay, so, well then it's like, so now we have this question, should the budget be balanced, right? A lot of people think it should be balanced. A lot of people think that it is not okay for the government to spend more money than they have, and then our country ends up in all of this debt. Well, most economists say no, it should not be balanced. What that means is that most economists are saying that, like, budget deficits are okay. So they're saying budget deficits are okay, meaning that or because they're okay because they're necessary. They're saying, hey, when tax revenues go down, that is a time when government spending is needed, and you can't do fiscal policy, you can't try to fix the economy out of a recessionary gap without a budget deficit, because that's the nature of what fiscal policy is. The economy is terrible. The government needs to help. Well, they have to do budget deficit spending, or they can't do any expansionary fiscal policy at all. That's what a lot of economists, not all economists, but a lot of them have to say about that question. All right, so page 4, the long run implications of fiscal policy. So if we're like, okay, we have to do this deficit spending, we have to have these budget deficits in order to help out the economy during a recessionary gap. Well, what does that mean? Well, expansionary fiscal policy leads to budget deficits, which leads to debt. Now, we need to know the difference between a deficit and a debt. A deficit is yearly overspending. That's if they took in $100 and spent $150. That would be a deficit of $50. A debt is the total amount owed to others. All right, so let's explain that by talking about my favorite topic, me. Okay, now in the year 2019, the last full year we've had, in the year 2019, did I personally spend more money than I made? Like, did me and my husband and my family, did we spend more money in 2019 than we made? No, we did not. In the year 2019, we did not have a budget deficit. Do we have a debt? Yes, we do. So a deficit is just talking about 1 year. A debt is talking about any money that you owe. So, do I have a debt? Yes, I do. I owe money on my house, right? So, the year that my husband bought this house, I say my husband because he bought it before I was married to him. We've only been married for a little over 2 years. When he bought this house in like 2015, that meant that, he went into a lot of debt to buy this house. And that debt is still around. Okay. Now, deficits make the debt bigger. Okay. But they are not the same thing. A budget deficit means that, okay, let's say that the government took in, $1 trillion in payment in taxes, and then they spent $2 trillion, right? So that would mean they had a deficit of $1 trillion. The debt is like all of those deficits added up together, and like all of that money from all those deficits that has not been paid back yet. Okay? If there was a deficit in 1 year, but that money has now been paid back, it's no longer a part of the debt. Any money that's already been paid back on all of that borrowed money is no longer a part of the debt. But in our country, we have been doing deficit spending every single year since, I believe, sometime in the 1990s, which means that our debt keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Like, our debt is huge. You can Google U.S. debt. If you Google U.S. debt clock, there's a clock that's on the internet that shows you like how big our debt is. So, what happens if the debt gets too big? Well, the first idea is if the government is doing tons of borrowing, like, when they borrow money, that comes from the loanable funds market, both here in the United States and in other countries. Well, if the government is taking up all those loans, that means that, businesses and people don't have those loans available to them. So that's a problem. But the bigger problem is that making the payments on the debt gets difficult to do. Okay. Now, when you're taking out a big debt like a house, what you're most concerned about isn't the actual price of the house, but what you're more concerned about is the payments on that loan that you have to make every month, right? Because we tend to think of our money in terms of monthly, like what we can do with it in a month. And so when we figure out how much we can pay for our housing, we're figuring out how much we can afford each month. Okay, so when you take out these debts, you might start thinking, oh my gosh, I have like this much on my house, and I have this much on my car, and I have this much on my student loans. And those numbers can be so big, those numbers for the debt get so big that we can't even like really understand them. But we can understand them in terms of the monthly payment. Okay, I have to spend $1,000 a month on my house. I have to spend $300 a month on my car. I have to spend $300 a month on my student loans, right? And so that would add up to $1,600. And then we can think, okay, can I afford $1,600 a month? Well, if you keep adding to that debt, if you're like, well, I'm going to go buy a couch with my credit card, and I'm going to go buy a kitchen table, and I'm going to take out a loan for that, and I want a boat, and I want a motorcycle, right? And then if the payments for the month get so big that you can no longer pay them, that is a huge problem. And it's the same with the federal government, where if the government can't make their payments on the debt, then that's a huge problem. All right, so let's go through this list. So if making those payments on the debt gets too hard, it can lead to the government cutting spending and raising taxes. And cutting spending and raising taxes is only an okay idea if the economy is doing really, really good. So if they get into that situation when the economy is in a recessionary gap, that is going to cause huge problems. They call that austerity spending or austerity cuts, and it's happened in a couple other countries lately, like Greece is a huge example, and it causes huge problems in the economy. Government borrowing more money to make payments on the debt. That is not good. When you have to borrow money from one person to pay it to another person, that is a terrible situation. You'll never, ever get out of debt doing it like that. And that does concern a lot of people if our government does that. And then the next, if you have so much debt that lenders can become not willing to lend you any more money. And same with the government. Like there are some places who are looking at the huge amount of debt that the US government has, and they're like, I don't think I want to give them more money because their debt is huge. And what if they can't pay me back? It makes them lose confidence in our abilities to pay them back. Okay, so the debt to GDP ratio is the last thing we're going to talk about here, where so it's the government's debt as a percentage of the GDP. And so if the government debt grows more slowly than GDP does, then it's easier to pay off that debt because, when GDP goes up, then the tax revenues that the government gets go up, so the government has more money to make those debt payments. But lately, our percentage of debt to GDP is really high. I wrote here that there's a figure on page 707. It looks like this. Now this so the left-hand side, this is the federal budget deficit since 1940. And you can see like during the war, they were spending a lot of money. And then, after the war, the economy was really good. And you can see that during like the 50s and 60s and or 50s and 60s, they would often go below zero, meaning that they were spending less than they made. But since about 1970, that only happened very briefly once in the late 90s. And since then, we've been doing a lot of deficit spending. Well, this is our public debt to GDP ratio since 1940. You can see during the war, it went over 100%. So that means like if their GDP was $1 trillion, their debt was over $1 trillion. And as you can see in this chart, currently our debt to GDP ratio is getting above 60% of our GDP. And so that just shows like it's going to get harder and harder to pay off the debt. So I would say that for this module, talking about the debt and the deficits, in conclusion, our question here, oh, whoops. We're not ready to conclude. I forgot a page. Page 6. All right. But I'll just say what I was about to say. Our question was, does the public debt influence our economy? Well, it's hard to say. In some ways, it's kind of like We have to have deficit spending during recessionary gaps if the government is going to help out at all. But all of that deficit spending leads up to a whole lot of debt, and the debt is okay until it reaches the level where it's not okay anymore, where it reaches the level where our government can't make their payments to the people they owe, and when it reaches the level where people don't want to give us any more loans, then we've got big problems. All right, so let's do our last page, which I almost forgot, page 6. All right, so this gives you the term impact liabilities. That's spending promises made by the government. It's not technically debt, but it's debt because it's money that needs to be paid. For example, if I said to somebody, I will give you $100, I didn't exactly take out $100 loan, but I owe those people $100, so it's kind of like a debt. And they're saying like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, those are all examples of impact liabilities. So here's our problem, and I mentioned this a little bit in our last module. The amount of these payments for Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security are expected to go way up in the near future because more people are retiring and collecting Social Security, and there's fewer people working and paying into Social Security. Also, our healthcare costs are going way, way up recently. So there is concern that our debt will soon be a problem because of those different reasons. Because will we be able to afford to make our payments on our debt? And will we be able to afford to continue to pay people Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid? All right, now we're done with this module. Don't forget to do your summary and do the practice problems and come to the Google Meet.